Well, good afternoon, everybody. Folks have their lunch. Delighted that you're here at the Aspen Institute, and we are in a great treat. Anybody remember the 1950s? All right, and those who don't remember them, you're going to get a good lesson into the 1950s and what it meant to our country. And I'm here. I'm Dan Glickman, and I'm Vice President of the Aspen Institute. And I grew up in Kansas, Wichita, Kansas, in the 1950s. And in fact, the airport in my hometown was named last year the Dwight D. Eisenhower International Airport. I don't think we fly any international routes out of Wichita, to be honest with you. But they still named it.
We're going to call it the regional airport if it was named for president.
So I have a great personal interest in the role of Dwight Eisenhower. And we're lucky to have a great historian, a great writer, Will Hitchcock. I think you all have his bio here. Professor at the University of Virginia, teaches World War II, knows an awful lot about the subject. We were having this great conversation. There's so many things to talk about here.
Yeah.
Nixon, civil rights, McCarthy, Sputnik, Gary Powers. I mean, just hundreds of things. But I wanted to start just more in a general question, because if you look at the book, just the last couple of pages, you talk about looking backwards. Eisenhower had an impressive record, whether it's at least in your book, and domestically and globally, kept us out of war. 1950s were by and large a peaceful era, and he was a man of values. You talk a lot about his character and values. So you come to the conclusion that he was a pretty good president.
Yes, I think. Thank you, by the way,
Yeah.
and thank you all for coming. And I'm jealous of your delicious-looking lunches.
We can get you one afterward. That's your fee.
I can't eat and talk at the same time. I do come to the conclusion, and I hadn't started there. I did not go hunting to write a book that said Eisenhower was the greatest human being in the world. I wanted really to write about the decade of the 1950s, using his presidency as a way to unlock a lot of key, interesting problems of the decade. And I think I accomplished that, and I learned so much about the 50s. And I'll just say as a preliminary, we can come back to this in the Q&A, many Americans, I think I'm right. I've talked about this book now around the country enough. I have the sense that many Americans still imagine the 1950s to be a certain thing, that in many ways it really wasn't. It's a kind of a mythical time when things were great, when everyone was peaceful and happy and prosperous and life was good. And what I found is it was a decade full of conflict, controversy, debate, and we'll talk about some of those things. And that meant that Eisenhower is a key guy to figure out, well, how did he handle these different crises? And I'll just give you three things that I think he did that were really consequential for the country. And what made him, if not great, certainly a much more consequential figure than I think historians have talked about. Too many people have said, who is this guy? He played a lot of golf. He didn't really do much. He played cards. He was married to Mamie. There's no there. On the contrary. We'll talk about Mamie. I'm really a big Mamie fan. Dramatically increased and built what we now call the warfare state. He had a dramatic impact on changing the place of preparing for war and deterrence and nuclear weapons in our government. Huge impact on the defense infrastructure, both in technology, science, and spending. During the 1950s, here's a statistic that I came across that blew me away. The United States spent 10% of its GDP every year on defense. 10% of GDP. Today, it's 3.3%. So during the 1950s, a huge federal effort to build out the capabilities of defense. Now that was sort of to keep the peace, but it had a huge impact on the country. Second thing that Ike did on the domestic side, he changed, in a way, kind of gave something of a heart or brain transplant to the Republican Party of the 1950s. The Republican Party was deeply divided, but it was really in the control of an old guard of isolationists at the beginning of the 50s.
Just the Taft?
The Taft wing. Eisenhower said, no, I'm going to pull you into the 20th century and make you more internationalist. He was a great believer in NATO, in coalitions, and working with allies. Now, he tried to moderate it and make it a centrist party, a moderate party. And as we know, he had only partial success. Because, of course, in 1964, Goldwater would run and be very right-wing and so forth. And the Republican Party has tacked back and forth between moderation and more, and moving more to the right. But Ike tried, and I think he had an important part in making the Republican Party embrace internationalism. Now that's a very important legacy. And then the last thing, the last way in which I think he's consequential and which I think reveals something about his character is he was a very disciplined man in his person. The way he carried himself, his weight was always exactly the right thing. He was always very careful about what he ate. He famously smoked 4 packs of cigarettes during the war. And then his doctor said, Ike, it's going to kill you. You have to stop smoking. And he said, okay. And that was that. Never smoked again. 4 packs a day for decades. He just dropped it. I put it out of my mind. Very focused man. And he brought that focus into the White House. The way he ran the White House was so disciplined, so organized.
Just like today's president.
It's so similar.
All right, okay.
And I just, he met with the press once a week. He met with the congressional leaders once a week. He met with the National Security Council once a week. He met with the cabinet once a week. And these were substantive meetings at which real decisions were made. So he brought, of course, he was a military man, and he brought a sense of discipline to the job because he said, when things get bad, you want to know that you've been planning, you've been thinking about what might go wrong. So in that sense, he was very well prepared. I think only George H.W. Bush comes close of modern presidents of having the right experience for the job. He was immensely well prepared for the difficulties of being president. And in a way, if he ever looked like he wasn't working that hard, maybe playing a little too much golf, it was mainly because he felt like the job wasn't too big for him. And that is a sign of his confidence in himself, in his own judgment. But this is a guy who had defeated Hitler in World War II. And when things were really bad, in 1942, in 1943, even in 1944, war was not going well. And he pushed on through and did great hard things during World War II. So by the time he's in the White House, it's like, well, I think I got this. I think I've got this.
If just on a side note, those of you who see the movie The Darkest Hour, where Churchill talks about his confidence in Eisenhower, and they apparently, that relationship stayed pretty smooth until Churchill died, which Eisenhower came and spoke.
He did. It's a great story that still needs to be written, the Ike-Churchill. They wrote many, many letters to one another over the course of a long relationship.
So I'm kind of got to move around a bit because we're going to get to Q&A. But you talked first about the military defense complex. So Eisenhower is very well known for his closing address, a farewell address, almost like the George Washington. The parallels are just striking about the military-industrial complex. Why did he do that? A man who had spent all of his years as a soldier, basically warned the country, watch out for this military-industrial complex.
The speech is great, and I urge you to go and, after today, go and listen to it. You can see it on YouTube or read it. And he says, basically, in a sense, he says, I'm very sorry at the end of my presidency that I haven't done more to lessen the threat of war and nuclear weapons. We've had to build a huge military-industrial complex. And he basically is apologizing for it. And but then what he's saying is, having done this, we did it in order to keep the peace, in order to deter the Soviets, and it has worked. It has been an anxious peace, but we've had 8 years of peace under Eisenhower. And then he says, now the task for all of us is to guard against the unwarranted influence of the military-industrial complex over our democracy. So it's a double-barreled thing. On the one hand, we're sorry we had to build this thing. The country had 20,000 nuclear warheads by the time Eisenhower left office. Each one of them was targeted at over 1,000 cities in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and in China. One button, Eisenhower could have eliminated half the population of the world. He said, I don't love that. That's not good. I'm sorry we live in that world. So the task is to protect against the influence of the generals and of the technocrats over the presidency. Now, remember, it's 1961, it's January 1961. He's on his way out of office. It's the second to last day of his presidency. Who's coming in to replace him? A 43-year-old junior senator from Massachusetts who has zero experience of executive leadership. My hypothesis is that part of who he is directing this speech to is to President-elect Kennedy, to say, you're not going to believe how much pressure you're going to come under from the generals and from the CIA to say, to do more, to build more, to take more risks. And it's your job as a leader to say, no, we're not going to do that. And I think it's It's like, I built the military-industrial complex. I'm retiring now. Good luck. It's a little curious.
Well, Kennedy faced that himself during the Bay of Pigs, where he had generals who were really anxious to pull the trigger.
In a matter of a couple of months,
Yeah.
Kennedy approves the invasion of Cuba by exiles that were trained by the United States in Guatemala. So it seems as if Eisenhower is prophetic. Suddenly, Kennedy is talked into this by Allen Dulles and by the generals and by the bureaucracy. He says, oh, Ike figured this thing all out. It's Eisenhower's plan. It's going to go great. Well, it doesn't go great. It's a disaster. And Kennedy learns, maybe there was something to that. I have to not trust the experts. Don't trust the generals.
So talk a little bit about we'll go into domestic affairs in a minute, but the voice of restraint.
Yeah.
Whether it's in Southeast Asia, Indochina, the French, whether it's Suez. It's not that Eisenhower was reluctant to use force, but by and large, you see a person whose judgment it is to not have as his first instinct attack.
It's true. It's a remarkable record. So 1953, he accepts the armistice in Korea that puts an end to the Korean War. He got a lot of criticism from the right wing for that because it looked like he wasn't winning. He was accepting kind of a half a loaf. But Eisenhower said, it's a war we can't win without using nuclear weapons. I don't want to do that, so I'll accept an armistice. So he stops the war in Korea, a hugely popular thing because the war was very unpopular in the United States at that time. The next year, 1954, the French are fighting a colonial war in Indochina. They're begging the United States to come in and rescue them because it's going very badly. Eisenhower says, I can't imagine a worse place to fight a ground war than the jungles of Southeast Asia. I am absolutely committed to keeping Americans out of the jungles of Southeast Asia. He says it over and over and over again. In private, he says it in public. So he avoids intervening in 1954 in Vietnam. Now, he then commits to help build South Vietnam and pledges American aid and so forth. That's another story. But he stays out when another president could easily have gone in. Vice President Nixon was much more likely to want to intervene at that time. So in those two examples, it's quite remarkable. In Egypt, our allies, Britain and France and Israel, invade Egypt in 1956, called the Suez Crisis. And they start a secret campaign to invade Egypt. Eisenhower says, this is a terrible idea. What are you doing? What are you thinking? You're going to set the entire Muslim world against us. This is an outrage. This is just the wrong way to do it. And he puts huge pressure on his closest allies, the British and the French, to get out of Egypt. And he basically forces them, compels them to withdraw from an invasion of a country. Now, he didn't like Nasser much. He was worried about it, but he felt that the Soviets would take this opportunity to invade further into the Middle East, as they were already doing. So these are just examples of a man who has been at war before. He understands that whenever you start a conflict, things happen that you hadn't predicted. There's always something around the corner, and it goes all wobbly in ways that you have no idea what's coming. So the best move is, don't start the war. If you're going to go to war, you have to do it, unfortunately, and this was the Clausewitzian in him, 110%, and you go in fully, completely, all in. And he was willing, it's scary this way, he was willing to do that. And the case that you all, some of you will remember and some of you won't, but look it up. Taiwan, or Formosa as it was called at the time, was constantly threatened by Communist China. Communist Chinese threatened to invade Taiwan twice, 1955, 58. Eisenhower said, if you do that, it's all-out nuclear war. And he meant it. He absolutely meant it. And we don't know if that was what deterred Mao from invading Taiwan. But I have no doubt, having looked at the conversations, that Eisenhower would have hit the button. Now, mind you, China didn't have its own nuclear weapons at the time, so it would have been a rather asymmetrical issue. But the man had ice in his veins. I will say he really was not sentimental about these matters. So that's what I mean by the 50s being interesting. Yes, there's restraint, but there's also things that didn't happen that could have changed world history. And Eisenhower had a sense for how to get out of some of these tangles.
Okay, so I want to go to the 50s in the area of civil rights, because if you read this book, it's just replete with Eisenhower and his Attorney General, I think an unsung hero, Herbert Brownell, that were engaged in the civil rights battles. Many criticized him for not being engaged enough, kind of lackluster engagement. But he did send troops in for the integration of Central High School in Little Rock. He was involved in the 1957 Civil Rights Bill. I wonder if you can talk about his role, and also the appointment of Earl Warren as Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court.
You know, Eisenhower doesn't get much credit for his policies on civil rights, and I think in a way I understand why. It's not a heroic story in the way that some of the great breakthroughs of the mid-'60s and late '60s are. But if you look at the record and you add it all up, it's a remarkable series of events that we have to, I think, understand better. So the way I think about it is as a pendulum. And initially when he comes in, there's a period of significant activity on civil rights. The desegregation of Washington, D.C., Eisenhower says, that's something we can do. We're going to push for that. And he uses the courts to start to desegregate the city. An African-American could not spend the night in a downtown hotel in this city in 1953. When Eisenhower became president. If you were taking a train from the north to the south, you had to get out of your car in Union Station in Washington, D.C. and go to segregated cars for the trip south. That is the presence of Jim Crow in the beginning of 1953. Eisenhower says, we can change that because we're the federal government. Wherever the federal power is, we have the ability to push against that. So he took some risks and went ahead in that regard within the District of Columbia. Then, the Supreme Court Supreme Court justice dies, and he appoints Earl Warren, a California moderate, to become Chief Justice. It's a huge decision because it leads Warren to then write Brown versus Board of Education, one of the most important.
Of Topeka, Kansas.
Of Topeka, Kansas, that's right.
Yeah.
Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Thank you very much for the Kansas shout out. Warren writes one of the most important Supreme Court decisions of the century, which says the segregation of public schools by race is unconstitutional. Now, already we're just in the first year and a half of his administration, and he's done something significant here in the district, and he's done something significant for the country. He could have appointed anybody else. He had the ability to. Warren was a recess appointment. And think of what might have happened if he hadn't appointed a moderate on civil rights, but he did, and he knew what he was doing. So we get Brown versus Board. But then he starts to worry. And remember who Eisenhower is. Grew up in Kansas, not a large African-American population, to say the least, in Abilene. He spends his entire career in the segregated United States military. He goes on vacation to Augusta, the National, in Georgia, totally segregated. So he's not sure about this. And a lot of his friends in the South start saying, look out, the South is going to rise up we'll have a huge crisis on our hands. And we see Eisenhower pulling back. But he can't avoid the issue because it keeps coming at him, And then he begins to push for a new Civil Rights Act in 1957 that is not terribly strong, but it's got some teeth to it, trying to strengthen the Justice Department to be able to prosecute violations of civil rights laws. And so finally, the big Little Rock, Arkansas case in which, against his own desires, his own sense of restraint, he sends in the 101st Airborne to accompany 9 black students who all they want to do is go to school at Little Rock Central High School. Eisenhower's framing of this, and I'll just end with this, his framing of this issue is what's the key to him. And it's where I think we see his tacticalness. When he sends in federal troops to compel and to protect the students to allow them to go, he doesn't say, this is a great moral crusade we're on. It is time in this country to end segregation. It is an outrage that we should have racial segregation anywhere in this country. He doesn't say anything like that. What he does say is the governor is trying to use state law to stop the enforcement of a federal court decision. It's a case of states' rights versus federal power. That is unconstitutional. As the chief officer of the executive branch of the government, I'm going to enforce the law. It's all about enforcing the law. He never frames this as a great moral question. And that is where people constantly come back and say, what a missed opportunity. And it was a missed opportunity. So this is what I mean by the pendulum. He's come so close to a breakthrough, kind of a greatness on the issues. He never quite gets there. And that's why I think he's a transitional figure rather than a person with total clarity on these questions. But I think it's an interesting political story nonetheless.
So just switching topics in the 50s, I want to go to Joe McCarthy. because often people remember those days as the real test of Eisenhower, political test of Eisenhower. And today we seem to have a lot of Joe McCarthys around, but their demagoguery was not just necessarily confined to him, but he was certainly embodied it. And Eisenhower tried to resist this for a long time, or use his Vice President Nixon to try to deal with it. But ultimately, he just couldn't take it any longer. And so talk a little bit about this as part of his character.
Yeah, so Joe McCarthy, Senator Joe McCarthy.
Some of you younger people, he was a rabid anti-communist who found them everywhere. There would have been, half the people in this audience would have been communists, according to McCarthy.
Any guilt by association, and he abused his powers as a chairman of a committee to interrogate people, investigate people. But I just want to emphasize, so what is the context of this story? So Americans between 1919 and the mid-1950s were profoundly suspicious of communism. It wasn't Joe McCarthy who created the Red Scare. The Red Scare had been going on since the end of World War I, been going on since the Bolshevik Revolution. Americans thought communism was very strange, subversive, backstabbing. It was anti-religious, it was anti-capitalist, it seemed to be anti-democratic, it seemed to be aggressive in terms of its foreign policy. Americans were very suspicious. Now, end of the war, World War II, there's a Cold War brewing, and the Soviets look dangerous. People are suspicious of the Soviets. Then what happens? Oh my goodness. It turns out the Soviet Union had actually sent spies into the most secret wartime program of all, the Manhattan Project, to build the atomic bomb. It turns out they really had penetrated the atomic program. They really did have Soviet spies in the atomic program. The first bomb the Russians use is a copy of the ones that the Americans are building in the Manhattan Project. So people know this. There's a sense of suspicion, of fear, of anxiety. Then 1950, what happens? The Korean War breaks out. Oh my goodness, the communists are on the march again. So I just want to stress that McCarthyism wasn't just one man. It was a society that was full of anxiety about communists maybe listening in, stealing our secrets, subverting our way of life. And people in authority often said such things. So Joe McCarthy, is already up and running from 1950 to 1953. Ike comes into office in 1953. How important do you think it was for him to say, well, the first thing I'm going to do as president is go after this senator who's in my own party, and he's a senator in the Congress. We've just taken back the Congress from the Democrats. So is it likely, just thinking politically, that he's going to want to go pick a fight with a powerful demagogue in his own party about communism? Of course not. Eisenhower initially says, I don't want to get into the gutter with that guy. I don't like his style. I don't like his demagoguery. But it's not going to help me or the cause if I make it a personal conflict. Many friends start writing to him and say, Mr. President, you've got to get out in front of this. You've got to condemn McCarthy. He's awful. He's killing the country. He's tearing apart the country, his charges. And Eisenhower, it takes him a year where he hopes he can kind of dodge and weave and maybe get Nixon to sort of back channel and say, Joe, we've got the Congress. We've got the White House. It's all great now. Lay off. McCarthy could care less about who's in power. He just wants the attention. So it's not until the beginning of 1954 that Eisenhower says we're going to have to do something, and that's because McCarthy starts investigating, wait for it, the United States Army. Because surely the Army must be full of communists. Well, it isn't. But McCarthy finds a few little nuggets, begins a process of investigations, and Eisenhower uses his power as president to start to turn the tables on McCarthy. One thing he does, and this will echo today, Eisenhower and his staff just put together a revealing dossier of material, very embarrassing to McCarthy and his committee, revealing that they've abused their power while they were doing a lot of scurrilous things. And they leak this to the press, and they lit a backfire, basically. Suddenly everyone says, McCarthy, look, he's been abusing power. And the Republicans in the Senate turn on him, and they make him get off of his committee, and they begin an investigation of McCarthy himself. So the famous 1954 Army McCarthy hearings are those in which the Senate's actually investigating McCarthy. So he's on the defensive. And so Eisenhower helps, I would say, to push McCarthy onto the defensive, but it's really the Senate that does its job of sort of investigating and embarrassing McCarthy, and then we see him on those televised hearings where he's so horrible and so awful, and the country starts to turn really rapidly against him. So This is a classic case of Eisenhower as a tactical leader, a man who didn't want to get his hands dirty but was willing to work behind the scenes to undercut McCarthy. Is that a heroic story? Not really. Is it effective? Yes. Is this what politics is more like than heroism? Yes.
Well, I had read that the two most watched television shows in the world in the first half of the 1950s were the coronation of Queen Elizabeth I and the Army Mccarthy Hearings. And the famous line by Joseph Welch, the attorney, "Have you no shame, Senator?" which has been repeated in recent days,
yes.
Actually, unrelated to McCarthy.
Well, it is a reminder just how much, the idea of congressional hearings as the sort of bread and butter of politics. This is not what, we got hearings, there were hearings in the Clinton period, at Benghazi, then we got hearings now, and we've got Mueller, and these sorts of things. This is not the first time. There are moments of these, kind of high-tech, televised crises that happen on the Capitol Hill, and they mark this one marks the era. It's a great moment of watching, in a way, the democracy worked against McCarthy. It was the Senate that finally censured him, that finally voted against him to condemn him. And they had their ear to the ground. They could see the ground was shifting under him, but they finally disciplined one of their own.
And then the final question before we get to questions, because there's so many other things I haven't covered, has to do with the domestic agenda during the 1950s. So Eisenhower ran, I guess, at the time, it wasn't sure if he was a Republican or a Democrat. He didn't like Truman and a lot of the policies of the Truman administration, and he was focused on a balanced budget and everything else. But Eisenhower was actually a moderate on domestic programs, wasn't he? I mean, many things that we have today were created during that administration.
It's interesting when you take a man who's never been in politics and put him in the White House. That probably never happens. But that's what happened in 1953. And no one really knew exactly what Eisenhower's sort of core values on politics were. Now, he ran when he started running, and the campaigns were so much shorter then. It was about 6 months tops. He sounded like a conservative. It was anti-New Deal, anti-state. I want to shrink the government and all that. And he gets in office, and he's president, and he says, well, Social Security is a very good thing. We're not going to touch that. In fact, let's expand it. He creates a new law that lets self-employed people benefit from Social Security, expand Social Security. Infrastructure spending, of course, one of his most significant ventures is the highway system. Figures out a way so that we create the Highway Trust Fund. So it's not a huge government spending program. Basically, every time you buy a gallon of gas, and about a quarter of it goes into the Highway Trust Fund, and it can only be used to build more highways, or at least that's how it was designed. So he's not against federal role for certain things. Of course, the defense programs are significant national security issues. Even on taxes, his basic view was taxes are what is your responsibility, and he says it in words that are so wonderful, and yet today would just, your career would just come to an end if you said these things in public now. He said every American wants to pay his, and he always used the word his fair share of taxes. No American wants to get a special deal. No good American would seek to get a loophole. Why, that's your responsibility as a citizen, and we all know that every good American is willing to do his part to help the country and pay taxes. I mean, and he believed that 100%. At the same time, he insisted on a balanced budget. And he balanced 3 budgets out of 8. By far the best post-war record in this regard of any president. No one else came close. Bill Clinton started to get there. But the other ones were also near balance. So he was a man who said, you pay taxes in order so we can balance the budget. We're not going to do it the other way around, where basically we just, everyone gets a free ride. No one has to pay taxes. You just get you never have to pay taxes, but we will, just constantly cut programs. His view was, no. You have to, if we can ever get the government funded just right, make it smaller and pay for itself, then you can have a tax cut, but not until then. We've completely reversed the priorities. So in this sense, he was a conservative in that he didn't like rapid social change. That's one of the reasons he was so popular. It turns out most Americans don't like rapid social change. He was a conservative with the use of federal money. But he was a moderate with respect to what the government's role is, to help people when they're down, to help them out when they're having trouble, to help them retrain, get a job, have a Social Security pension. He didn't think government was evil. He didn't hate government. In fact, he had been a federal employee his entire life. He believed the government could do great things, like defeat Nazi Germany. You know, I have to stress, that was, the United States government did that, people. So he believed the government could do great things. But he wanted it to be done carefully, judiciously, with restraint, and to pay for it.
And the last question, this may put you a bit on the spot, but what would he think about Donald Trump? You know, I mean, just...
Well, it's not that awkward a question, because I think we can really imagine it. On the one hand, he would say, well, you know, this is not... He would dislike his public behavior. He would dislike his vulgarity, and I use that word, but I think that's fair. I think vulgarity has become part of Trump's political style. It's combative, it's aggressive, you know, it's insulting, but that's who he is, and it's worked for him. Eisenhower would not have liked that. He did not like the idea that the White House should be seen as so partisan. He was, in fact, himself a man who thought the presidency was supposed to be a national office, to unite the country, to be above party. He wasn't always above party, but that's what he aspired to do, become a national figure. On the other hand, I'll say that, remember the 50s. In the 1950s, the old guard of his own party, not just Joe McCarthy, but there were some real, like, pretty strange people in the Senate, on the Republican right, who were conspiracy theorists and who kind of agreed with McCarthy, you know. And so what he would have said is, I recognize Donald Trump. I recognize the strain of political sort of ideology that he represents. It's part of our country. It's always been there. He experienced it in the 50s. And I think what he would have said is, it's our job to figure out how to bring it closer into the family, into the center, and have a conversation and moderate it, find common ground. He was not a, you know, kill your enemy kind of politician. So I think he would have said, boy, that's just politics. If you don't like it, you know, go find some other profession.
Okay, all right. So first I want to recognize Alma and Joe Gildenhorn. They fund this series. They're not here today, but I appreciate that. And we also have 30 high school students attending the event from the DC International School. Raise your hands so I can see who's here. So we appreciate your being here as well. And so let's open it up for questions or comments. Just gentlemen up here, and we have mics, I think. I don't know where the mics are, but they're coming. But if you stand up and can speak loudly, okay, we'll get you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there is a.
I have one comment and one question.
You might state your name just so that.
Quan.
Yes.
In deference to you, I want to just say that Eisenhower thought a lot about the farmer and did put in a lot of programs for the farmer, including the Food for Peace program, I guess, in 1954. So anyway, you might want to comment on that. But I always have wondered why Eisenhower didn't know what was going on in Suez. How did England and France and Israel, you know, think that that was a good move to sort of circumvent him?
Well, they lied to him. That's how he didn't know. But why did they think it was a good move? I think they felt it would be a fait accompli, that they would invade Egypt, topple Nasser, and Eisenhower would say, oh, darn, because I'm so sorry you did that, but at least Nasser's gone. I think they felt there would have been some affinity, that they would have America would have secretly approved it, because Nasser was a very difficult character, a charismatic nationalist who seemed to be pushing the colonial powers out of the Middle East. But your question's a good one, because if you look at the phone calls between Eden, the prime minister, and Eisenhower in the month or two running up to that crisis, every single time they talked, Eisenhower said, well, one thing's for sure, we're not going to use any military force in Egypt, right? Anthony, you there? Have I got you? You know, and Eden's like, can't hear you, can't. But so the British didn't listen to the clues that Eisenhower was sending. And I think they felt, too, that this was still a sphere of British and influence. This was still in the 50s. The colonial powers had not completely unwound their empires. France, after all, was fighting a colonial war next door in Algeria. They felt, hey, Nasser's helping the Algerian fighters. We don't like him. We're going to go after him. So they had sort of their own military and colonial ambitions in the region. And they felt this is not really America's call. Turned out to be a huge mistake. The UK was much more vulnerable to economic pressure from the United States than they realized. Eisenhower turned the screws brilliantly until it hurt, and the British had to withdraw as a result of Eisenhower's actions. Anthony Eden resigned a broken man. His career came to an end. Eisenhower broke British Prime Minister Anthony Eden over Suez.
Let's see.
Serious business.
Back there, this gentleman. Yeah, and I'll keep going around the room.
Thank you. I'm Charles Cobb. One question. How did Eisenhower get along with Nixon?
It's a great story, and there's a wonderful book by a friend, Jeffrey Frank, called Ike and Dick, if you're interested. Which is a lovely book, beautifully written. The short answer is they didn't get along. And Ike did not bring Nixon into the sort of presidential family. They never socialized together. He never took him to Gettysburg. He took Khrushchev to Gettysburg. He never took Nixon. They were a generation apart. Nixon was intimidated by the fame and acclaim that Eisenhower always had. Nixon was such a sort of feline sense of politics, such a political animal. Eisenhower disdained politics, or at least said he did. Right from the beginning, they got off on the wrong foot during the 1952 campaign when there was an alleged scandal about Nixon's finances, and Eisenhower had kind of implied Nixon should resign, and he didn't. Nixon said, I'm not getting off the ticket, no way. I've got this thing, I can taste it. I'm not gonna resign, and he didn't. Eisenhower ever after thought, but I gotta watch this guy, he's dangerous. And so he always wanted Nixon to be better, let's put it that way. He wanted Nixon to become the standard bearer of the Republican Party. And Nixon kept not quite filling out the role as Ike would have liked. So it's a wonderful portrait of two very different figures with different views of the political process and of politics. And by 1960, of course, he says he wants Nixon to win. He can't stand Kennedy, but he doesn't help him a great deal. And he's very ambivalent about it.
Well, the story. What was his great positive response to Nixon?
Terrible. There's a press conference, and a famous press conference. The press says, "Look, Mr. President, you keep saying Nixon is so experienced and has done so much while he's been your vice president. He's so ready to take the off. Could you just name one thing that he's done as vice president that really is his signature achievement?" And Eisenhower is leaving the press conference. It's late, he's kind of gathering up his notes, and he sort of says as he's walking out the door, "Oh, if you give me a week, I'll think of one." Poor Nixon just crumpled. He wasn't there, but he just never got over it.
This gentleman right here, and then we'll get to you.
I'm Phil Webster from the Aspen Y Fellows, and I was brought up during the Eisenhower years. They were a tremendous time to be brought up. But in my adult years after that, nobody really thought about Eisenhower. He was kind of the Franklin Pierce of his time, or the Benjamin Harrison. You didn't
Who are those
think,
people? Just kidding.
Who were they?
Have you written a biography of those people too? All right.
You didn't think about them at all.
Yeah.
Now suddenly I'm reading that presidential historians like yourself are rating him number 5 of all of the presidents. Why was he so underrated after he was president? And why is he suddenly the number 5 best president we ever had?
Well, actually, the key to both questions, great questions, and the key to both is Kennedy. And I'll tell you why. Kennedy, the Camelot machine destroyed Eisenhower's reputation. Now, Kennedy is an admirable figure, and people, I don't mean to detract, but politically, John Kennedy ran against Eisenhower in 1960. He didn't run against Nixon. And he did a lot of damage to Eisenhower's reputation. And he's so charming and such a good campaigner and so electrifying and so young and so smart. And he said, Eisenhower was yesterday's man. He is old, he's out of date, he wasn't running the show, he wasn't here. 7 lean years have withered the field of ideas, Kennedy said. Withered the field of ideas. I mean, he had Sorensen just teeing up these gems. And Ike they had nothing. They had no response to it. And by 1961, Kennedy in office, it's a generational shift. And suddenly Eisenhower might well have been Franklin Pierce for the distance between him and Kennedy. And then the values, the age, the demographics of the 60s are so different and mark such a break with the 50s. So I think that's a big part of it, that the media fell in love with Kennedy, and who didn't? I mean, many people did fall in love with him, but they just turned their eyes away from Ike. Then why would he be rising? Part of the reason is other people are falling. One of them is, ever so slightly, John Kennedy's been slightly starting to fall, and it's not because he wasn't, because his potential wasn't great, it certainly was, but I do believe that some scholars are now starting to weigh more his moral issues in the portrait of him. And that's starting a slightly depressive fact, which is opening the way towards the rise of a sort of middle-of-the-pack guy like Ike. But also Andrew Jackson often was in the top 10. He's starting to slip because of his views on race. And another figure who was always in the top 10 who's starting to slip was Woodrow Wilson. And his views on race we now recognize as antique and segregationist. So some of these figures are lowering, and that's opening the door to Eisenhower. And it's interesting, number 5. Yeah.
Let's see, this young lady right here.
So I skimmed through the chapter on Jim Crow, and I thought it was really interesting and actually relatively objective. The one question I would have is, why do you feel like his views changed so drastically from the beginning of president to the end? Because near the beginning of his presidency, as you pointed out, he was very, not vocal, but he made a lot of strides for civil rights. But near the end, the White House was silent on very the horrible things like that happened, like the Emmett Till lynching.
Right. No, this is exactly you've captured exactly the ambivalence that I write about in the book. We get this president who's capable of doing great things, and then constantly we find is saying, "I've gone too far. I've got to pull back." I don't think he ever escaped who he was and his own background and his own worldview. I don't think he ever escaped the influence of many of his white, wealthy friends who were in his cabinet and who were his closest associates. Most of the Army generals who had helped him or who he had come up with in the Army were Southerners or had ties to the South. He'd spent a lot of time in the South himself. And he constantly said, "My friends in the South are telling me, don't go so fast." And this is a man that I think we can see trying to figure out, how can he wall this issue off? How can he make it into a story about, well, we're just going to enforce the law and keeping the larger moral questions at bay? And his presidency ends with talk about an unfinished agenda, just so much more still to come. The point about the book, though, is that how much did he do that we can say, well, it moved the story forward? There are milestones, and the Brown versus Board decision, the Civil Rights Act of '57, and the Little Rock decision are important milestones on any account that you would give of the civil rights movement of the post-1945 period. That doesn't turn him into a crusader on that issue. He was very much captured by who he was and where he came from.
See, I think there was a lady over there, yes, with the black hat. That's you.
Looking for the mic.
Thank you very much. I'm Elizabeth Sinclair. Irrespective of the known response to the slap heard, Eisenhower's known response to the slap heard round the world, can you give us your opinions on General Eisenhower's overall thought about General Patton?
Well, Patton and Ike were friends, had been friends for years, had known each other since they were very young officers. And Patton outranked him initially. And Patton had more money, he was more charismatic, he had all the glamour and glitz. And Patton was very resentful of the fact that Eisenhower always kept getting the plum assignments, that the generals loved Eisenhower. They were always pulling Ike out of obscurity to say, give it to Eisenhower. He's good. And his star was rising. Patton was, he wanted to earn his acclaim on the battlefield. And Eisenhower was a desk general. He was a brilliant logistician, a brilliant planner. So they were two very different men. And his handling of Patton during the war, I think, was absolutely appropriate. And he penalized him. Germans couldn't believe it. They kept saying, that army in England is certainly coming after us. You remember the fortitude business. They had Patton commanding a fake army before D-Day. Germans thought that's the most see-through deception program. Of course Patton's going to be in there, and he wasn't. Eisenhower was punishing him for his behavior of slapping a soldier who was suffering from what might have been then called shell shock. We now recognize as PTSD. Patton slapped him. So there you are. Patton, of course, died at the end of 1946, right after the war. So they didn't have a post-war relationship, obviously, but two very different men.
See, yes, in the back, gentleman in the purple shirt. Try to get as many as I can in here.
Hi, my name is Marty Sherwin. I was very taken by your explanation of Eisenhower's ambivalence or ambiguity to dealing with the domestic issues. And it occurred to me that it's a very good explanation of his foreign policy also. You said he wouldn't go into Vietnam, but he appointed Diem. He wouldn't go into Vietnam, but he wouldn't have the 1956 Geneva election that was scheduled. He overthrew Arbenz in Guatemala. He overthrew Mossadegh in Iran, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
There's a legacy of real problems that he left the United States with.
True, all true. It's all in the book, so don't worry. This is this is the key thing, is that I'm a historian, like you are, and he's written a lot of very important, influential books, and I'm not a hagiographer. This is not a book that you will say, well, every page, Eisenhower is the best human being on the planet. In fact, like most presidents, there's a complicated and unfinished legacy. You mentioned some of the covert operations, support for Diem in South Vietnam, the overthrow of government in Guatemala, overthrow of government in Iran, this attempted overthrow in Indonesia, an attempted overthrow, ultimately successful, but not by the Americans in the Congo, and of course Fidel. Boy, Fidel, it was that close. They constantly try to get rid of Fidel. So, well, doesn't that tell us that actually Ike was a crook and a terrible man? Well, my view is Eisenhower viewed covert operations and nuclear deterrence as part of the same package. What's his overall goal? Overall goal, avoid major great power conflict with the Soviet Union. Check. Did that. Did that by building out a huge nuclear deterrent at great cost and at great anxiety. But that's not the only problem facing the United States in the 1950s. The question is, what's going on in the periphery? What do these third world nationalists represent? Are they a threat to American interests? Eisenhower and all of his advisors believed that they were a threat to American interests, and so they used a different tool, covert operations. Small, relatively cheap, relatively deniable operations to do certain dirty things around the world of the kind that you've described. So you're right that we now look at this through the lens of this is illegal. It seems morally wrong, but also politically short-sighted. Look at all the terrible things that have happened. That's not how Eisenhower looked at it, and we're historians, so we have to figure out, why did he do these things? And the answer is, it was about containment, deterrence, but also making sure that on the periphery, America kept pushing back against what it viewed as the advancing threat of communism. We'll never stop debating whether this was the right thing or the wrong thing to do, and that's one of the reasons I like working on the 50s. Thanks for the question.
Let's see, the gentleman, and then I'll get this young lady here.
How do you compare the roles of Marshall and Eisenhower in winning World War II?
Oh, well, I mean, Marshall was the architect of victory in so many ways. George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army. Marshall, what can you say? He was one of the most important Americans of the mid-century, not nearly as well known because he never became a president. But he created the machine that Eisenhower then used in battle. That's how I would characterize it. I describe them as maybe arguably the best tandem of general officers the United States ever had. Certainly in the 20th century, maybe there's some Civil War buffs that would argue about Grant, but certainly I think they're a remarkable pair, and they got along very well. Yes.
There was a question right here. Yes, up near the front.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Momona. I was wondering, how did Eisenhower's experience in the military influence him as a leader, please?
Thank you. That's a great question. On the one hand, and he wrote about this a lot, on the one hand, it made him determined never to have a war again. So he came back from the war, and immediately he was asked, he was given awards, he was asked to do speeches. And whenever he got up in public, he would say, the greatest pacifist that you will ever know is a general officer who's seen war. He never wants combat. He doesn't want to go to war ever again. If you've seen what I've seen and what those men in Europe that I commanded saw, you will know it will never want to go back to war again. So on the one hand, he said, I want peace, and Americans want peace. On the other hand, he said, how do we achieve that? And his answer was not go to the United Nations and shake hands and just sort of say, let's just work out our problems through conversation. He said, no, we're going to build the biggest, most fearsome deterrent against our enemies so that if they ever challenge us, they will know what a high price they will have to pay. Does that make sense? I'm not sure, but that in a nutshell is the whole argument of the way the United States basically ran the Cold War, which was to deter enemies, hoping to impose a kind of peace, anxious peace, a peace under the nuclear shadow, but peace nonetheless. And at least in his term, it worked. It may have come at a high price, but he did avoid combat troops on the ground during his term in office.
Yeah, let's see, in the back there. But one thing I would ask you, obviously his likability or his EQ was a big part of his success. I would think probably in the military it had a lot to do with him rising to the top.
I think his emotional intelligence, his IQ was very high. I think he was enormously intelligent. The idea that he was a dummy, that he was somehow just a goofy guy, I mean, that is so not true. He was very, very smart. Yeah. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you. My name is Caitlin. Some of the later actions of Eisenhower seem out of context from the initial character that you established and the one that I think is portrayed in his last speech. And I flipped through some of the chapters of the book and was reading about Cuba.
Oh, yeah.
And so I feel like, yes, deterrent is one thing, and that's a way to mitigate or prevent war, but revoking diplomatic relations before the inauguration seems like a very bold move that's out of character from his legacy. So why do you think that he did that?
Well, I'll just disagree with you a little bit. I don't think it was out of character at all. I think that Eisenhower viewed Fidel Castro as a dangerous figure. And he viewed Castro and communism, again, was Castro even a communist? Well, not clear, certainly not at the beginning. Maybe he became more radical. But it was very easy. It was very easy for Eisenhower, for John Foster Dulles, for Allen Dulles especially, to fit Castro into a pre-existing framework. Leftist, radical, comes to power through a grassroots revolution, and he begins land reform. He's anti-capitalist. He wants to redistribute wealth. He wants to get the big Western and American industries out of Cuba. They just go right down the line. It maps on perfectly. So this is, for Eisenhower, a radical communist figure, 90 miles away from the United States. Can't let that happen. So within really less than a year of Castro coming to power, beginning of 1959, the United States begins to plan for his overthrow. And and Eisenhower knows all about it. The plan is, the paper trail is substantial. Initially, they're not sure how to do it. Not going to be an invasion by American military forces, but they're going to try to use covert operations, and they begin to do this, put into plan an effort to get him out. So let me just make clear that nowhere in here do I suggest that he always made the right decision or a wise decision. I'm interested in knowing why he made these judgments. And it maps onto a worldview that was very, very powerful inside the defense establishment, inside the CIA, inside the White House, and it's not a partisan thing, because Democratic President John Kennedy came to exactly the same conclusion when he came into office. So Castro is the great, boogeyman for both Eisenhower and for John Kennedy. And of course, Castro would live on for the entire Cold War period, and he would play that role for many subsequent presidents. So, yeah.
Let's see, this lady right here. And then I'll get to this gentleman over
Thank you. My question has to do with the Dulles brothers and how you referred to them a minute ago. But I'm interested, pardon me, I'm interested in how much they influenced Eisenhower, because in my view, everything they thought of and did was bad. And so it dealt with American exceptionalism, and we're better than anybody else, so we can do anything. So what was Eisenhower's view?
And how do you get an airport named after him, too? I'd always been interested in that.
But only after one Dulles.
Yeah, one Dulles, right.
Yes, yes. Well, airports in D.C. have gone through some name changes, haven't they? I still call it national, but anyway. Whatever. Sorry, that was my one political slip.
Yeah.
John Foster Dulles and his brother Allen Dulles were Secretary of State and the head of the CIA, respectively. Wow, imagine having a pair of brothers who themselves were very close and who spent a lot of time together and who had drinks in every afternoon together. That's a lot of influence. John Foster Dulles was thought to be the real hawk initially. He was thought to be the super hawk, and people thought, well, Dulles as Secretary of State, he's going to be saying, start World War III, and so on. Eisenhower had John Foster Dulles on a pretty short leash, and I don't think John Foster Dulles dramatically influenced Eisenhower to do things he wouldn't have done anyway. So that tells us that Eisenhower was himself pretty hawkish. But it also tells us that on certain issues like Vietnam or on Suez, Eisenhower was much more restrained than John Foster Dulles. The other guy, though, Allen Dulles, actually, I think, had a significantly more deleterious effect on Eisenhower's policy and on his legacies in many ways. Allen Dulles, I came to the conclusion after doing all this research and watching him operate, I will just say it, I think he was a very dangerous man. And he turned the CIA from a very sort of amateur operation into a major power center for plotting not just the kind of third world coups that we talked about, but secret operations of really quite breathtaking variety and scale. So Allen Dulles had more distance from Eisenhower, and Eisenhower wanted it that way because he didn't want to be caught up in all the dirty tricks that Dulles was up to. But that had a very negative consequence, was that Ike wasn't controlling him tightly as he did John Foster Dulles. So the three of them make an interesting triangle, and I feel that Ike should have fired Allen Dulles certainly after the U-2 crisis, which was basically Dulles's fault. He didn't, and that meant that the Bay of Pigs continued into the Kennedy period, and only then did Kennedy finally get around to getting rid of Allen Dulles.
So you've mentioned the U-2 crisis. We have our former ambassador from the Soviet Union, Jim Collins, here. So he may, I don't know if that's his question. But,
Actually, Russian Federation.
Russian Federation now.
But look, the one person you haven't really mentioned at all is Khrushchev.
Yeah.
And I'd like just to get a sense for how you think that relationship or non-relationship worked.
I think I write quite a bit about the relationship because they meet each other in Geneva in 1955, and then in 1959, Khrushchev has the wonderful tour of the United States. It almost blew up. It almost went wrong. Disneyland and so forth, but Khrushchev comes. So what does that mean? It means that Eisenhower, despite the Cold War, despite the missiles, despite dirty tricks, believes that personal diplomacy, summit diplomacy, can be effective. And the 1955 meeting with the Soviet leadership, Stalin dies in 1953, and so no one really knows who's in charge. And he gets the measure of them in 1955 at Geneva, and he says, you know, these people, these Soviet leaders, I recognize these people. I can put myself in their shoes. I think we can find a way to coexist. I don't think they're wrong. I think they're ideologues, but I think they're human beings. I think there must be a way to reach them. 1959, Khrushchev comes to the US. They go to Camp David together. They disagree about issues like Berlin and so on. They don't come to a meeting of the minds, but they're sitting there in their shirt sleeves at Camp David talking about the Second World War. And there's a sense that the Cold War is starting to change just a little bit. That the personal relationships that later presidents will emphasize you couldn't have imagined that in the Stalin period. Of course, Roosevelt would meet with Roosevelt, different era, really. Stalin had just died in 53, and these things are happening only a few years after. So these are significant uses of Eisenhower's charisma and political capital to say, I want to try to develop a relationship. It doesn't go very well in the long run. And that's partly because both sides are so ideologically committed to a particular worldview. Khrushchev coming to the United Nations in 1960, embracing Fidel Castro, saying, boy, the Soviets are the leader of the world revolution, constantly sticking it to the Americans. The fiasco over the shoot-down of the U-2 in May 1960 worsens that relationship. So I would say that that relationship had promise, and it might have been another missed opportunity where perhaps Eisenhower could have found a way to give a little bit more. We do know that Khrushchev probably wanted that May 1960 summit to continue, and Eisenhower refused to serve up Allen Dulles' head on a platter, which he should have done, And then he could have had the summit, but he wouldn't do it. He said, nope, it's my fault. I did it, and I'm not going to fire anybody over it, and I won't apologize. Khrushchev said, all right, that's it. Forget it. We're done. So missed opportunity, I think.
Let's see, there's this gentleman right here. Been very patient. And I'll get to this young lady, and then we'll probably begin to wrap up.
I was interested in your bringing up the famous Nixon hasn't done anything for, and I'll think about it for a week. As a college student all during the 50s, we used to get together and read the transcripts of his press conferences, which were published then in the New York Times.
Yeah.
And they were good for laughs every week. We thought the man, could not get two words out together and not make a blunder. And I wondered, isn't that part of the reason that he kind of didn't stay afloat, historically, and that Kennedy made him look so bad because Kennedy was obviously just the opposite. We wondered how America could vote for him compared to Adlai Stevenson, who was obviously externally brilliant in 1956. We wondered, why was all this happening? What did he think about Stevenson? Did he ever get along with Taft, by the way, also?
He did. He got along with Taft died in the summer of 1953, so they didn't have too much time to work. They got along okay. So Eisenhower was thought in part to be syntactically challenged because he would give these press conferences that sounded like gibberish. I've watched quite a few of the ones that were televised, ones that were taped, and again, I find him actually very, very clever at saying certain things and avoiding saying other things. One of the things to remember is Eisenhower held a weekly press conference. How many press conferences have recent presidents held that are not scripted? A weekly half an hour, walk across from the White House to the Indian Office Treaty Room, wherever it's called, in the Executive Office building, and he would hold his conference there, and the press came at him pretty hard. And he had domestic policy, tax issues, trade policy, science policy, Cold War policy. They'd come right at him, and he would answer back. So yes, he avoided answering the question. That's what he was pretty good at doing. He'd been doing it during the war. It made him look dumb. Kennedy had the gift of looking smart while not answering the question. So I'll guarantee you that. Stevenson also was a brilliant speechwriter, a brilliant speech maker. By the way, Stevenson's choice for his vice presidential nominee in 1952 was John Sparkman of Alabama, who was a segregationist. Let's just remember the Democratic Party of that era was worse on civil rights in many respects, certainly the Southern Democrats were anyway, than Eisenhower's Republican Party. I just have to get that in there because the parties have scrambled a little bit on these matters since that period. But many people, you all remember Mary McGrory, if you're old Washington hands, and I read her memoir about this, and she said, when we heard Adlai Stevenson speak, it felt like the Christmas morning of our lives. He was just so sparkling in what he said, and they usually heard him speaking, rather than seeing him. People fell for Adlai Stevenson. He was gifted, he was charming, he was Kennedy, but just not quite as handsome. And we missed rhetoric in the Eisenhower years, I will grant you that. We missed the gift of political rhetoric that Kennedy brought.
See, there was a question, I think, right, yeah. There's two of you right together, so whoever wants to go first.
My name is Truly, and I was skimming through the book, and I noticed a picture of Eisenhower talking about the space race, and I was wondering what you thought his view on space was and trying to get into space was.
That's a good question. He wanted, his principal focus was on building the nuclear deterrent, building intercontinental ballistic missiles that could reach all the way around the world, and that was a very, very complicated thing to do. The Soviets in 1957 put a satellite into space, Sputnik, and that turns out to have been hard, but not nearly as difficult as building a missile with precision that could hit a particular target on Earth, i.e. go into space and come back down. The American missile program had focused on intercontinental ballistic missiles, not on satellite technology. Oh no, it was such an embarrassment when it happened. The Soviets got there first. So after Sputnik, the government begins to put into a speedy program to do both, to pursue a space program and to continue to pursue nuclear missiles. And they do, and the Americans will get a satellite into space the following year. So so they match the Soviets, and then of course they overwhelm them in terms of technology. Eisenhower created NASA, so as a result of the Sputnik embarrassment. And it was clear that the purpose of NASA was science, technology, and yes, getting a space program, even getting a man to the moon. What would then happen in the Kennedy and the Johnson years was built upon a foundation laid in the late Eisenhower period.
Great. This gentleman right next to you.
My name is Daniel Guevara. My question has to be more so how you became, like, why did you choose to write about Eisenhower? Not only that, but why to 1950s?
Yeah.
Because in the beginning, you were explaining how in 1950, you were researching about 1950s, and then you found Eisenhower and how he was a great president and the things he did. Why 1950s, though? What made you want to start in the 1950s in the first place?
And I might add to that, and your role as a historian.
Yeah.
It's very important that people, especially the younger people, know, why is this important to them?
Yeah.
Why are you doing this?
Well, so I had written a book about the end of World War II just before this one, and it was a very, very granular story about the liberation of Europe. And it focused on individual people at the end of the war in Europe, communities of people in France and Germany and Belgium and elsewhere. And it was a very hard book to write in the sense that it was full of pain and suffering and refugees and displaced persons. It was a very different kind of book. So as a historian, as a writer, I wanted to try something different. I wanted to try to write a biography. It's not a choice historians are trained to do because biographies tend to be, you end up praising your subject more than historians are comfortable with. So I wanted to avoid that trap, and I settled on Eisenhower in part because I thought it was an opportunity, because there still hadn't really been, I thought, a very good book on his presidency. So it was an opportunity. So I wanted to avoid the trap of just falling in love with my subject, and I think I did that carefully. I'm critical when I think it's fair, and I'm praiseworthy when I think it's fair. Being president is extremely difficult. We haven't had a perfect one yet. We've had a couple of really extraordinary ones in the course of the last 250 years, but we've also had, of the 45, I think it's fair to say, quite a few duds. So the question is not, am I going to fall in love with my subject and talk about him as a perfect figure, but rather, why, once you come into office, do you make the decisions that you make? Like I said at the beginning, I'll just end with this. At the moment, the United States is going through a very strange time. And we have fallen back in love with a mythical land called the 1950s. That's not a good thing. The 1950s was a time of terrible nuclear anxiety. It was a time of segregation and Jim Crow. It was a time of secret government that worked in terms of covert operations with no accountability. In many respects, that changed during the 50s, and I show that Eisenhower played a role in changing that. But let's not fall in love with the past when we think, well, there's just a lovely, mythical, happy time when everything was perfect. If only we could go back there when America was great, etc. Well, don't buy it for an instant. There were crises, there were disappointments, there were shortcomings, and it takes a people and political leadership to try to find their way through those problems. That's part of what started to animate me towards the end of the writing. Thanks.
Okay, well listen, let's give Will Hitchcock a great hand.
Thank you.
And he'll be out here signing books.
Okay, great.
The more books he signs, the better his family will do. So anyway, we appreciate your being here.
Thank you all for coming.